In the late 90s, Pokémon was everywhere. Trading cards, anime, toys, and of course the original Game Boy games. But in 1998, Japan got something the rest of the world wouldn't see for another year. A bold experimental project called Pokémon Stadium for the Nintendo 64. This wasn't just Pokémon, but on TV. This was the franchise stepping out of the pixelated 2D world and into a full 3D arena, complete with dramatic camera angles, announcer commentary, and animations that made your favorite monsters feel alive in a way the Game Boy simply couldn't. And here's the thing. Pocket Monsters Stadium wasn't even close to the kind of full-fledged adventure we were used to. It had no real story mode. Instead, it was all about two things: battles and minigames. You could pick rental Pokémon and jump straight into a fight, or, and this is where it got really exciting, you could transfer your own Pokémon from the Game Boy games using the transfer pack. That meant your team, your moves, and your personal journey from the tiny handheld screen could suddenly appear in glorious 3D on your TV. It sounds simple now, but back in 1998, this was mind-blowing. Seeing your Blastoise stomping onto the field with a splash of water effects, or your Charizard breathing fire across the arena, was like watching the anime come to life. The announcer calling out the action in real time only made it more intense. Every hit felt bigger, every knockout more dramatic. But here's where the magic really was: the animations. While the original Game Boy games showed the same static sprite shaking back and forth for every attack, Stadium's Pokémon actually moved. A Machamp would lunge forward with a punch, a Hitmonlee would stretch out its leg for a kick, and even the fainting animations had personality. Some Pokémon would collapse slowly, others would just topple over like a brick. And these weren't cheap one-size-fits-all animations. Yes, some moves shared similar motion, but there was an impressive amount of unique work here. Pokémon that didn't normally learn a certain move would still have a custom animation for it. The team at Nintendo's EAD division, which included none other than future Nintendo president Satoru Iwata and Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, wasn't just making a game. They were putting on a show. Why could they pull this off back then? Two big reasons. First, the N64 was a powerhouse compared to the Game Boy. On handheld, you had limited memory, tiny resolution, and almost no processing power for animations. On N64, you could store and display dozens of full 3D rigs, effects, and camera sweeps without breaking a sweat. Second, there were way fewer Pokémon to deal with. Stadium only had the original 151 in its first version and 251 in the sequel. That's nothing compared to the nearly 1,000 we have today. With a smaller roster, you could afford to give each Pokémon more attention. It's worth remembering, at the time, 3D animation in games wasn't automatic the way some people assume today. This was the late 1990s. Every rig had to be built from scratch, every move had to be animated manually, and effects like smoke, flames, and water were cutting-edge tech. Stadium didn't just look good for a Pokémon game, it looked good compared to most games, period. And then there were the camera angles. This wasn't just a static top-down view of two Pokémon trading blows. Stadium's battles felt like televised sports events. The camera would zoom in on a Pokémon's face before an attack, tilt dramatically during a powerful hit, and pull back for the knockout moment. It was cinematic, dynamic, and gave even the most basic move a sense of weight. For a lot of kids in the West, the first time they ever saw Pokémon in 3D wasn't in the anime. It was here. And for those of us who grew up on the black and white Game Boy sprites, it was like Pokémon had jumped into the future overnight. But here's what's fascinating in hindsight. Stadium's success set expectations. Players now knew Pokémon could look and feel like this. They'd seen the personalities, the flair, the over-the-top effects. And once you've experienced that kind of energy, it's hard to go back to watching two static sprites shuffle in place, which is exactly why, as we move forward in the Pokémon timeline, you'll see the series struggle to keep that magic alive, especially once the mainline games finally make the leap to 3D. Because while Stadium had the luxury of focusing purely on battles, the future mainline games would be juggling massive story modes, hundreds more Pokémon, and tight annual release schedules. In other words, Stadium had room to shine. The games that came after wouldn't be so lucky. And that brings us to the next chapter in this story, where 3D Pokémon started to evolve, but also began making trade-offs that we're still feeling in modern games. When people look back at Pokémon Stadium and its sequel today, they often say, how did they pull this off in the late 90s? Why do these animations sometimes look better than modern games? It's a fair question, especially if your mental image of modern Pokémon battles is a floating Pidgey slowly flapping its wings in place, or a giant deer spinning in midair without moving its legs. But to really understand why Stadium's 3D looked so sharp back then, you have to put yourself in the context of the time, both in terms of hardware power and game design scope. Let's start with the obvious. The Nintendo 64 was light years ahead of the Game Boy in raw power. On the Game Boy, the Pokémon battles you saw were static sprites, tiny 2D images drawn pixel by pixel, with maybe a few frame changes for attack effects. That was all the system could handle. The N64, by comparison, could store and display fully rigged 3D models, complete with bone-based animation systems, real-time camera movement, complex particle effects like smoke, fire, and lightning, multiple texture layers for shading and detail. On the N64, a Pokémon didn't just use Thunderbolt. You could have electrical sparks build up around its body, an explosion of light at the target, and a dramatic zoom in on the hit. That simply wasn't possible on handheld hardware of the time. The resolution bump alone changed everything. Instead of tiny sprites crammed into a 160 by 144 Game Boy screen, you were seeing Pokémon blown up to full TV size, with clear outlines, smoother colors, and visible expressions. Another huge factor was the sheer number of Pokémon, or rather, the lack of them. Pokémon Stadium 1 only had 151 Pokémon to worry about. The sequel, Pokémon Stadium 2, expanded to 251. That's it. Compare that to the modern number, which is closing in on 1,000 creatures, each with their own unique body shapes, movesets, and animations. With a smaller roster, the developers could afford to give each Pokémon bespoke attention. That meant more unique animations per Pokémon, custom reactions for certain moves, personality-driven idle and fainting animations, even in cases where two Pokémon shared the same animation skeleton, say multiple bipedal fighters like Hitmonchan and Machamp. Animators could still tweak the details to give them a distinct vibe. Today, that level of per-Pokémon animation detail just isn't practical when you're trying to ship a game with hundreds of creatures every 2 to 3 years. The scope has exploded, but the production timelines haven't. Here's another key point most people forget. Pokémon Stadium didn't have to worry about overworld exploration, gym puzzles, NPC scripting, or dozens of towns and routes to design. It was purely about battles. That meant the team could pour all their energy into making those fights feel dynamic. Every attack, every reaction, every flashy camera sweep was crafted to keep your eyes glued to the action. It's like the difference between watching a sports broadcast and watching a movie. In the mainline Pokémon games, battles are just one part of a much bigger adventure. In Stadium, battles were the adventure. Speaking of battles, the camera work was half the magic. In Stadium, the camera wasn't afraid to get in close, tilt at extreme angles, and track the Pokémon mid-attack. This made every move feel bigger than it really was. Even if the actual animation was just a simple forward lunge, the camera could make it look like a devastating charge. Fast forward to today, and you start to see where things get tricky. Once Pokémon battles moved to fully open-world maps in games like Scarlet and Violet, the camera had to be tied to wherever you happened to be standing. That meant fewer opportunities for dramatic cinematography and fewer chances to hide animation shortcuts. We can't underestimate this. Back then, just seeing your Pokémon in 3D was enough to wow players. Nobody was sitting there frame by frame analyzing whether a model's leg moved realistically. The novelty was doing all the heavy lifting. When you've only ever seen Pikachu as a flat 2D sprite or a drawing in the anime, watching him turn his head, blink, and leap toward his opponent felt groundbreaking. Modern players, though, they've been spoiled by decades of gaming. They've seen fur rendering in Monster Hunter, fluid combat animations in Final Fantasy, and cinematic boss fights in Elden Ring. The bar is so much higher now, and Pokémon battles are no longer just competing with nostalgia. They're competing with every other big-budget 3D game out there. This one's a little counterintuitive. Pokémon Stadium wasn't developed by Game Freak, the mainline series studio. It was handled by Nintendo's EAD division, which had the full backing of Nintendo's internal resources, including legendary figures like Satoru Iwata and Shigeru Miyamoto. Because they weren't tied to the yearly release cycles of the handheld games, they had more breathing room to experiment, polish, and iterate. That freedom is a luxury modern mainline Pokémon developers rarely get. When you add it all up, the hardware edge, the smaller roster, the battle-only focus, the dynamic cameras, and the novelty factor, it's no mystery why Pokémon Stadium looked so impressive for its time. The real mystery is what happens when you try to scale that magic up to nearly 1,000 Pokémon across massive maps with strict deadlines and constant player expectations. And that's where the story starts to shift, because the next era of 3D Pokémon battles would trade Flash for efficiency, and not everyone would be happy with the results. By the early 2000s, Pokémon was ready to make another leap into home console territory. But this time, things were going to look and feel different. In 2002, Nintendo brought in a brand new studio called Genius Sonority, led by Manabu Yamana, a veteran developer who had previously worked on the Dragon Quest series. And they gave him one job: make Pokémon RPGs for home consoles. This was a bold move. Unlike Pokémon Stadium, which was purely about battles and minigames, the new GameCube titles would try to merge the mainline battle system with a console-style RPG structure. The result? Two cult classics: Pokémon Colosseum, 2003 in Japan, 2004 internationally, and its sequel, Pokémon XD, Gale of Darkness, 2005. Right away, you could tell these weren't your usual kid-friendly Pokémon stories. Instead of playing as a bright-eyed trainer from Pallet Town, you were a mysterious ex-criminal stealing Pokémon back from villains. Instead of starting with a tiny bird or rodent, you began with an Espeon and an Umbreon, a clear signal this was aimed at older fans. Instead of traveling a wide-open region, your movement was limited to fixed maps connected by world travel screens. But when you stepped into battle, that's where Genius Sonority carried over the magic from Stadium, and then began reshaping it. Colosseum didn't reinvent the wheel when it came to 3D Pokémon animation. In fact, it straight up reused many of the rigs and models from Stadium 2. But instead of building every move as a totally unique animation, Genius Sonority took a more systematic approach. They introduced something that would change the way 3D Pokémon battles were animated for years to come: animation categories. Here's how it worked. Every Pokémon got a standard idle animation, a hurt animation, and a feint animation. For attacks, animations were grouped into broad types: status moves, physical moves, and special moves. If a move was physical, the Pokémon would use a general lunge or strike animation. If it was special, maybe a charging up motion. Status moves got their own unique stance or gesture. This meant that instead of animating 300+ individual moves for each Pokémon, you could reuse the same animation for multiple moves, changing only the particle effects and camera work. From a production standpoint, this was genius. Pokémon numbers were growing, and animating every attack uniquely for every single one was already becoming impossible. But from a player's perspective, it was a subtle shift. On one hand, it gave the games consistency. You could instantly recognize a physical attack versus a special one, no matter the Pokémon. On the other hand, it meant less personality. In Stadium, A Machamp's punch looked nothing like a Hitmonlee's kick. In Colosseum, they might both just use the same close-in and strike animation. Here's the thing, though. In Colosseum and XD, this system worked. Why? Because Genius Sonority still cared about presentation. The battles weren't static. The camera still swooped around the action. Effects like fire, electricity, and ice still popped against the darker, more realistic environments. The pacing was deliberate, not too fast, not too slow, giving attacks time to breathe. And remember, the GameCube was more powerful than the N64. This meant cleaner models with more polygons, better texture resolution, smoother lighting and shadows, larger, more varied battle arenas. Even with a systematic animation style, the game still felt alive because the camera work and effects sold the moment. By the time XD rolled around, Genius Sonority had refined their process even further. Animations were smoother, and certain Pokémon had extra flair, like Lugia's dramatic Shadow Blast or Salamence's intimidating wing spread. The game's darker tone helped too. Moves like Shadow Rush felt more aggressive thanks to the color grading and particle effects, even if the base animation was still a physical attack template. Then, in 2007, Genius Sonority released Pokémon Battle Revolution for the Wii, a game that was basically a love letter to the original Stadium titles. No story mode this time, just pure battle spectacle. And here's where things got interesting. They kept the animation category system from Colosseum, but layered in more variants for certain Pokémon. Some Pokémon got run cycles for physical moves instead of just lunging in place. Effects were flashier, and the Wii's hardware allowed for higher resolution and better lighting than ever before. Battle Revolution also doubled down on the dynamic camera angles. If Colosseum was a hybrid between Stadium and a mainline game, Battle Revolution was pure presentation again, an arena showcase designed to make battles feel like events. Looking back, this period is crucial for understanding where Pokémon's 3D battles went next. Genius Sonority proved that you could reuse models and rigs across multiple games, standardize animations without losing all visual appeal, keep battles feeling exciting through camera work and effects, rather than bespoke animations for everything. This approach was efficient, scalable, and, importantly, sustainable for a growing roster of Pokémon. But it also quietly set a precedent that the mainline series would adopt when it finally made the leap to 3D on handheld consoles. And that's where things start to change. Because when Game Freak took over the 3D battles in Pokémon X and Y, they inherited the category system, the reuse of animations, and the efficiency mindset. But not always the same level of presentation flair. Which brings us to the next chapter. The mainline Pokémon series finally goes 3D, and the honeymoon period begins. By 2013, the world had been waiting over a decade for the mainline Pokémon games to finally make the jump to full 3D battles. The spin-offs like Stadium, Colosseum, and Battle Revolution had shown it could be done, but Game Freak's handheld titles were still firmly in sprite territory, even as the rest of the industry had moved on. Then came Pokémon X and Y for the Nintendo 3DS. For the first time ever, the core Pokémon RPGs featured fully modeled, fully animated 3D Pokémon in the same battles you'd been playing since Red and Blue. And the hype was massive. When X and Y released, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive, at least at first. Pokémon now had depth. They weren't flat sprites on a green battlefield anymore. You could see them from different angles, watch them turn their heads, and even witness custom animations for certain signature moves. Mega Evolutions brought cinematic transformation sequences, giving battles a much-needed injection of spectacle. In short, it felt like Pokémon had finally caught up to its own spin-offs. But here's the thing. While the models were brand new for the 3DS, the animation philosophy wasn't. Game Freak had clearly taken inspiration from Genius Sonority's standardized category system. Every Pokémon had an idle stance, a hurt reaction, and a faint animation. Physical moves triggered a forward lunge. Special moves triggered a charging stance. And status moves had a smaller set of unique gestures. The real variety came from particle effects and camera angles, not wildly different movement for each move. This approach made sense. By Gen 6, the roster had ballooned to over 700 Pokémon. Animating every single one uniquely for hundreds of moves would have been a nightmare. But it also meant that if you looked closely, you started seeing the same animations pop up again and again. Compared to the Stadium or Battle Revolution games, X and Y's animations were notably more restrained. Flying and levitating Pokémon often just hovered. No flapping, no dramatic loops, just a slow, steady glide in place. Game Freak later explained that part of the reason for this was Sky Battles, a gimmick battle type where only airborne Pokémon could participate. Since these battles were in midair, it made sense for the Pokémon to maintain a hovering idle animation. And rather than make separate idle animations for regular ground battles, they just kept the same one. From a practical standpoint, it was efficient. From a player's standpoint, it sometimes made battles feel stiff. One thing X and Y did keep was a form of dynamic camera. The angles weren't quite as dramatic as Stadium or Battle Revolution, but they still changed during moves, zooming in for impacts, panning across the field, and framing big attacks with just enough flair to keep things engaging. That camera work went a long way toward hiding the fact that many animations were reused templates. When you're focused on the big picture, you don't notice that quick attack and headbutt might use almost the same movement. At launch, most players weren't complaining about reused animations. The novelty of seeing Pokémon in 3D for the first time in a mainline game overshadowed any nitpicks. Critics praised the visuals, the smooth animations, and the sense of scale the new perspective brought to battles. But here's where things get tricky. Game Freak didn't just use these models for X and Y. They used them for every mainline 3D game that followed. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Sun and Moon, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and eventually Sword and Shield. Year after year, players saw the same animations, the same idle stances, the same fainting poses. The novelty wore off, and what once felt like a technical achievement began to feel stale. When Pokémon Sun and Moon hit the 3DS in 2016, Game Freak tried to inject some extra energy into battles with Z-moves. These were over-the-top special attacks that came with unique camera sequences, explosive effects, and trainer animations. Some Z moves were signature attacks tied to specific Pokémon, and these got more bespoke animations. But most were generic, and that's where the limitations of the category system became obvious. If the move required the Pokémon to travel across the battlefield, it often did so by simply sliding or floating forward in one piece. No running, no footwork, just a full model translation. For a small Pokémon like Jigglypuff, it could look charming. For a massive legendary deer, it looked like someone was dragging a figurine across the floor. It's easy to say, well, Game Freak should just animate more variety. But remember, by Generation 7, we were dealing with 800 plus Pokémon. Even adding one or two unique moves per Pokémon is an enormous workload, especially on a handheld console with limited storage and processing power. That's why the core animation set for most Pokémon remained the same from X and Y through Sun and Moon. The extra personality was saved for new Pokémon, new forms, and signature moves, things Game Freak wanted to spotlight. Here's the kicker. In Stadium, Colosseum, and Battle Revolution, Pokémon battles were the main attraction. They were where all the development time and presentation flair went. In the mainline 3D games, battles were just one part of a much larger game. A game that also had to handle exploration, story events, world building, multiplayer features, and now gimmicks like Mega Evolutions and Z-moves. The trade-off was inevitable. Less bespoke animation per Pokémon, more reliance on reusable templates, and a slower pace of visual innovation. At this point, the cracks were starting to show for some fans, but the real storm hadn't hit yet. Players were still generally satisfied with the look and feel of battles, and critics still praised the animation quality for a handheld series. But the moment Game Freak announced they'd be cutting Pokémon from the roster in Sword and Shield, citing better animations as one of the reasons, all of those years of reuse and standardization came back to bite them. Because now, fans weren't just looking at the battles as they played. They were freezing frames, comparing animations from 2013 to 2019, and asking, if these are the same animations we've had for 6 years, where are the better ones you promised? That's when the goodwill from the Gen 6 and 7 3D era started to crumble, setting up one of the biggest controversies in modern Pokémon history. By the time we reached 2019, Pokémon had been running on the same 3D models and base animations for 6 years. That's X/Y, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Sun/Moon, Ultra Sun/Moon, all sharing the same foundation. Fans had noticed, but it wasn't a crisis. Until the announcement of Pokémon Sword and Shield for the Nintendo Switch. In June 2019, during E3, Game Freak confirmed something that had never happened before in a mainline Pokémon game. Not every Pokémon would be transferable into the new game. It didn't matter if you'd caught them in a previous game, raised them for years, or transferred them all the way from your old cartridges. If they weren't in Sword and Shield's Pokédex, you simply couldn't use them. This quickly got a name from the community: Dexit, a mashup of Pokédex and Brexit. When fans asked why, Game Freak's directors, including Junichi Masuda and Shigeru Omori, gave 3 main reasons. Game balance. With so many Pokémon, keeping battles fair and competitive was becoming impossible. Development resources. Having fewer Pokémon would free up time to focus on other features. Better models and animations. The extra time would allow them to improve the quality of animations for the Pokémon that did make it in. On paper, it sounded reasonable. Animating over 1,000 Pokémon in high quality is a colossal task, and the Switch's higher resolution meant flaws would be more visible than on the 3DS. But that third reason, better animations, was about to blow up in their faces. As soon as Sword and Shield footage dropped, fans started analyzing it frame by frame. They compared attacks, idle poses, and fainting animations to footage from X/Y and Sun/Moon. What they found didn't look like better animations. In many cases, it looked like the exact same animations, sometimes even with the same timing quirks and clipping issues from the 3DS days. For example, Pikachu's idle and faint animations were unchanged. Many physical attacks still used the same forward lunge template. Certain moves, like double kick, still had the infamous 2 hops in place animation, rather than any actual kicking motion. It didn't matter whether these animations were actually improved in subtle ways. The perception was that Game Freak had cut hundreds of Pokémon and delivered nothing to justify it. This wasn't just about animations anymore. It was about trust. For years, fans had accepted the reuse of models and animations because it was framed as a necessity. Too many Pokémon, not enough development time. But once Game Freak promised better animations as part of the trade-off for cutting Pokémon, those reused assets felt like a broken promise. And the Switch's hardware made it harder to hide. On the 3DS, low resolution and smaller screens naturally smoothed over animation shortcuts. On the Switch, with higher resolution and bigger displays, the stiffness was more obvious than ever. Things got messier when some fans claimed the Sword and Shield Pokémon models were identical to the 3DS models, just upscaled. Data miners even pulled the files and compared them side by side, finding near-identical geometry in many cases. Game Freak never fully addressed this point directly, but their public statements didn't help. The more they insisted these were new models, the more determined the community became to prove otherwise. Even if Game Freak had genuinely re-rigged or touched up the models for the Switch, the public narrative had shifted. They cut Pokémon, said they'd make new animations, and gave us the same ones we've had since 2013. By this point, Pokémon was no longer just competing against nostalgia. Players were comparing it to everything else on the Switch. Games like Monster Hunter Rise, Xenoblade Chronicles, and The Legend of Zelda. Breath of the Wild had sprawling worlds, fluid animations, and high production values. And Pokémon, despite being one of the highest-grossing media franchises in history, wasn't matching that level of visual polish. To fans, it felt like Pokémon had fallen behind, not because the animators were untalented, but because the development process was stuck in an efficiency-first annual release mindset. Here's the irony. By most industry accounts, Game Freak's animation team is small for a franchise this big. They were also under intense pressure to release a new Pokémon game almost every year, especially with Pokémon Go reigniting global interest in the brand. Given those constraints, the decision to keep using a core animation set and just add unique flourishes for new Pokémon or special moves was the only practical option. The alternative would have been delaying the game for years. But players don't see production schedules. They see the final product. And in the final product, that better animations promise didn't match what ended up on screen. The Dexit controversy quietly cemented an unspoken rule in modern Pokémon development. If you're going to reuse assets, don't frame it as a visual upgrade unless the changes are obvious at a glance. The trust hit from Sword and Shield wasn't just about Pokémon being cut. It was about the feeling that the cut wasn't used to deliver what was promised. This is where the long-term reuse of the XY animation set became a double-edged sword of pro. It allowed Pokémon to scale to huge rosters without exploding the dev schedule. Con, it created a visible ceiling for animation quality that, once noticed, was impossible to ignore. And because the Switch is a home console, not a handheld, the public's baseline expectation jumped, even though the internal workflow at Game Freak hadn't really changed. Sword and Shield still sold over 25 million copies, becoming the second best-selling Pokémon games ever after Red and Blue. From a business perspective, nothing failed, but the controversy left a lasting scar on the community. It also set up a new kind of challenge. If players were already skeptical of Pokémon's 3D animation quality, how would they react when the series took its biggest structural leap yet into open-world style gameplay? That's exactly what we'll look at next, in Section 6, the open-world shift and camera problem, where Pokémon Legends, Arceus, and Scarlet Violet change how battles work and accidentally strip away one of the most important tools for making animations feel exciting. After the Sword and Shield controversy, Game Freak had a choice: stick to the old formula and polish it, or take a risk and shake things up. They chose the latter, and in 2022, we got Pokémon Legends, Arceus. This wasn't just another mainline entry. It was a full rethinking of how Pokémon battles could work in a larger, more dynamic world. And it introduced something that had been teased in Sword and Shield's wild area, but never fully realized: battles that happened right where you stood. In Legends, Arceus, wild Pokémon roamed freely in large open zones. You could sneak up on them, throw a Pokéball without even entering a battle, or get attacked directly and dodge roll out of the way. When battles did happen, there was no transition to a separate battle arena. They just started, right there in the overworld. That meant the fight could take place next to a cliff in a river, or in the middle of a field of wild Pokémon. Your character could move around during the battle, changing your viewing angle in real time. There were no artificial walls or perfectly framed stages. It was fresh, immersive, and a huge step forward for the feeling of Pokémon. But it came with a big trade-off. In Stadium, Colosseum, and Battle Revolution, the dynamic camera was half the magic. It zoomed in to show a Pokémon's face before an attack. It tilted dramatically to sell the force of a hit. It followed movement across the battlefield, hiding animation shortcuts and emphasizing impact. In Legends, Arceus, that cinematic camera was gone. The battle camera was essentially your camera, whatever angle you happened to have when the move started. On paper, that gave players freedom. In practice, it meant the presentation of battles was far less dramatic. If you were standing too far away, attacks looked tiny and underwhelming. If a Pokémon lunged forward, you might only see their back. The lack of intentional camera cuts meant battles felt flatter, even if the animations themselves were more complex. This is a key point a lot of casual players miss. Even the best animation can feel boring if the camera doesn't frame it well. Think of it like filmmaking. An action scene can be full of stunt work, but if it's shot from too far away or at the wrong angle, it loses all impact. In earlier 3D Pokémon games, the camera was the director. In Legends, Arceus, you were the director, whether you wanted to be or not. That meant the animators could create great work, like a Pokémon dashing forward with proper running cycles. But if you were standing off to the side or too far back, you'd barely notice. Later that same year, Game Freak doubled down on the open-world approach with Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, this time aiming for a true seamless region with towns, gyms, and routes all connected in one massive map. And here's where the camera issue became impossible to ignore. Battles could trigger anywhere, on hillsides, in narrow caves, at the edge of water. Since the game kept your overworld position for the battle, the camera often had to work with awkward terrain, resulting in bad angles or obstructed views. Sometimes the camera would clip through the environment or fail to focus on the attacking Pokémon at all. Worse, Scarlet and Violet tried to bring back a bit of the dynamic camera, having it swivel or zoom in during certain moves. But because the battlefield could be so unpredictable, these moments often felt inconsistent or half-baked. In earlier games, even if a move's animation was just a quick forward lunge, the camera could make it feel powerful with a close-up before impact, a shake effect at the moment of contact, a quick cut to the target's reaction. In Scarlet and Violet, without controlled staging, the same lunge might happen in a wide shot from 30 feet away, looking like a tiny shuffle. This is why fans sometimes say animations in modern Pokémon look lazy. Not because the movements themselves are worse, but because the camera isn't showing them in their best light. Open-world gameplay also brought another visual problem: environment style. Sword and Shield, Legends, Arceus, and Scarlet Violet all lean toward a more realistic texture style for grass, rocks, and dirt. But the Pokémon themselves kept their cleaner, cartoony shading. This clash could make them feel like stickers placed on a photoreal background. Worse, in large open areas, the realistic environments often looked bland compared to the stylized backdrops of older games. Players compared the foliage and ground textures to PS2-era graphics, especially in Legends Arceus, where much of the terrain looked muddy and repetitive. Stylized environments like those in Breath of the Wild age better and fit better with the exaggerated designs of Pokémon. But Game Freak seemed committed to pushing a realistic look, even though it didn't play nicely with their own character models. Here's the irony. Scarlet and Violet actually had more unique animations than any mainline Pokémon game before them. Some Pokémon had different idle stances for standing versus floating. Certain attacks finally got new bespoke animations. Small flourishes and personality cues were added for many creatures. The problem? A huge chunk of those details went unnoticed because of two things. The open-world camera made it easy to miss them entirely. Many animations played too quickly to appreciate. It's a cruel twist. Animators put in the work, but without the old battle staging, that work didn't get the spotlight it deserved. By removing the cinematic camera and staging, Pokémon battles in open-world games started to feel more realistic, but also less special. Instead of feeling like you were watching a high-energy anime battle, you were watching two creatures fight in the middle of an empty field. No dramatic framing, no choreographed shots, just whatever angle you happen to be standing at. For a series that built its identity on spectacle, from Ash's gym battles in the anime to the roaring stadium crowds in the games, that's a big shift, and not everyone was on board. The open-world push in Legends, Arceus and Scarlet Violet expanded the scope of Pokémon, but it also stripped away one of the most effective tools for hiding animation limitations: controlled cinematic camera work. And while the animators may be doing more than ever behind the scenes, the way battles are presented now makes it harder for that work to shine. Which brings us to one of the most frustrating truths about modern 3D Pokémon. Sometimes the animations aren't the problem at all. It's the timing and framing that make them feel underwhelming. That's exactly where we're headed in Section 7, Missed Potential and Hidden Details, where we'll look at how good animations are being buried by speed, code, and presentation choices that keep players from even noticing them. By now, you can probably see the pattern. Early 3D Pokémon thrived on smaller rosters, focused battles, and cinematic cameras. Modern 3D Pokémon juggles massive rosters, open-world gameplay, and limited camera control. But here's the twist most players don't realize. In many cases, the animations in modern games are better than they look. You just never get the chance to see them properly. Scarlet and Violet actually introduced a surprising amount of new animation work. Many Pokémon now have separate idle stances depending on whether they're standing, crouching, or floating. Certain moves have brand new bespoke animations that aren't shared with any other Pokémon. Some Pokémon even have special details, like hair or scarves that react during attacks, or subtle changes in posture depending on the battle situation. The problem? The game rarely gives you the time or the framing to actually notice any of it. One of the biggest complaints about older games like Diamond Pearl or even XY was that battles felt slow, animations would play out at a measured pace, and every feint or status effect got its own pause. When Game Freak shifted to the Switch, they clearly decided to speed things up, keeping the gameplay snappier and cutting down on dead air between moves. It worked, maybe too well. Attack animations can finish in less than a second. Camera cuts, when they happen at all, are over almost instantly. Unique idle poses might only be visible for a moment before the next turn begins. This means even well-crafted animations can flash by so quickly that they don't register with the player at all. Animation and gameplay are tied together by code, and if that code doesn't sync up perfectly, animations can lose all their impact. For example, if the damage number pops up too early, it steals focus from the attack itself. If the feinting sequence starts before the attack animation finishes, the motion gets cut off. If a Pokémon returns to its idle stance too quickly after attacking, the follow-through looks unnatural. These are tiny details, but they matter, especially in a game where the presentation is already working with limited camera variety. There are even examples of animations that only trigger under very specific conditions, meaning most players might never see them. For example, some Pokémon have unique feinting animations that only appear when they're hit by certain move types. Alternate forms or shiny variants may have small flair differences in how they attack or recover. A few species have hidden personality gestures that only appear in specific weather or status effects. But if those moments happen during a random overworld battle with a bad camera angle, you're probably going to miss them entirely. Fans sometimes bring up examples like Sausage Tyloyan, a nickname for Talonflame's attack animation, where its signature flame scarf only appears briefly during attacks. The animation itself is fine, but it's easy to miss because it only shows during certain moves. The move plays out so quickly that the detail doesn't stick. The camera angle might not even face the Pokémon when it happens. This sums up a huge portion of modern Pokémon animation critique. The work exists, but it isn't presented in a way that makes you appreciate it. In game design, there's a simple truth. Players judge what they see, not what you made. You could spend weeks animating the perfect tail flick or wing flap, but if the game doesn't frame it well, or if it happens too fast to notice, the player's takeaway will be, the animations are lazy. This is why the older spin-offs often get more praise, despite having fewer animations overall. They made sure the ones they did have were staged, timed, and framed for maximum impact. When fans ask for better animations, they often mean more complex, unique, and expressive animations. But the deeper fix isn't just creating new ones. It's making sure the existing ones are timed properly so they land with impact, framed dynamically so the player can actually see the important details, given breathing room so they don't get lost in the battle's pace. Without that, even an animation that took weeks to make can feel invisible. The irony is that Pokémon is one of the few franchises that could easily justify and benefit from making battles slower in certain moments. Not slower overall, but with brief bursts of cinematic emphasis for key attacks, feints, or special abilities. Imagine if Scarlet and Violet had a toggle for cinematic mode, where the camera temporarily took control during strong or signature moves, like Stadium or Battle Revolution. The animations wouldn't have to change, but the presentation could make them feel brand new. Modern 3D Pokémon games have more animation detail than they get credit for, but because of pacing, camera limitations, and event timing, much of that work goes unnoticed. It's not a matter of the animators being lazy. It's about how their work is integrated into the game, and whether the game gives players the time and perspective to actually appreciate it. And that brings us to the final big question. After years of reuse, scope creep, open-world experiments, and hidden animation work, what does this all mean for Pokémon's future? That's what we'll cover in Section 8, the future of 3D Pokémon battles, where we'll talk about the upcoming Pokémon Champions, whether it can recapture Stadium's magic, and what the series would need to do to truly wow players again. We've gone from the cinematic spectacle of Pokémon Stadium in 1998 to the sprawling, camera-loose open worlds of Scarlet and Violet in 2022. Over that journey, we've seen animations go from handcrafted for 151 Pokémon to standardized templates for nearly 1,000. Cameras shift from choreographed TV broadcast-style cuts to player-controlled free movement. The art style pivot between stylized backdrops and semi-realistic worlds. And now we stand at a crossroads. The next big entry on the horizon, at least as far as we know, is the battle-focused spin-off Pokémon Champions, positioned as a kind of successor to Stadium and Battle Revolution. If the rumors and early descriptions are true, Champions could finally give Pokémon battles the same treatment other competitive games get, full focus on combat, instead of balancing it against exploration and story. The ability to stage fights in dynamic, visually rich arenas, freed from open-world terrain quirks, allowing the return of cinematic camera work. If Game Freak, or whichever team is handling Champions, plays their cards right, this could be the first time in years that every battle feels like an event again. The million-dollar question: will Champions have all Pokémon available at launch? With over 1,000 creatures, the scope is enormous. If they do include all Pokémon, it will almost certainly mean heavy animation reuse, unless they've been building new animation libraries quietly for years. If they don't, they risk sparking another Dexit-style controversy, unless they're upfront about the scope from day one. The safe bet? Champions will probably launch with a curated roster, but focus on making those Pokémon look better than they've ever looked before. If Pokémon wants to truly wow fans again, whether in Champions or future mainline titles, they'll need to pull from what worked in the past and adapt it for the present. That means cinematic camera work. Bring back choreographed camera cuts for big moves, feints, and climactic moments. Use slow-motion close-ups and dynamic angles to make even simple animations feel powerful. Timing and pacing adjustments. Let key moments breathe. A critical hit, a signature move, or a feint should get a fraction more screen time. Don't rush animations to save half a second if it means the impact is lost. Animation variety where it counts. Not every move needs a bespoke animation, but signature moves and fan-favorite species deserve unique flair. Add subtle idle variations for Pokémon types, flyers, swimmers, crawlers, so the battlefield feels more alive. Environment style matching. If you're going realistic with textures, tone down the cartoon shading on Pokémon. Or better yet, lean into stylized environments that complement their look. Highlight hidden details. If a Pokémon has a unique animation, make sure the camera and battle flow show it off. Don't bury it in a half-second clip from 20 feet away. Of course, all of this comes with a caveat. Pokémon is still on a near-annual release schedule. Game Freak and its partners don't have the luxury of 5-year dev cycles like other AAA studios. That means reuse will always be part of the pipeline. Not every Pokémon will get bespoke treatment. Better animations will always be competing with time, budget, and the need to ship a new title in sync with merchandise, anime, and trading card releases. But if there's one thing the series has proven, it's that presentation choices can make even reused animations feel fresh, as long as they're framed and timed well. This isn't just a Pokémon problem. Fighting games like Street Fighter and Tekken rely heavily on camera and timing to sell their moves. RPGs like Final Fantasy reuse animation skeletons, but hide it with smart staging and effects. Pokemon's challenge isn't unique. It's just magnified by the scale of its roster and the expectations of its fanbase. Imagine a future where open-world exploration and cinematic battles coexist, perhaps by transitioning into stylized arenas when combat starts. Animators are given time to expand the template library, so even shared animations feel more varied. Camera work, effects, and pacing are treated as seriously as the moves themselves. It's not impossible. In fact, much of the groundwork is already there, buried in the code, waiting for the right presentation to bring it to life. Pokemon's journey into 3D has been a balancing act between ambition and practicality, spectacle and scalability. The early years of Stadium and Colosseum showed us what's possible when battles are the main focus. The modern era has shown us what happens when those battles have to share the stage with massive worlds, hundreds of creatures, and tight deadlines. The next leap, whether it's in Pokémon Champions or the next mainline entry, will be about reconciling those two worlds. If they can bring back the drama and presentation flair of the past, while keeping the scale and freedom of the present, Pokémon battles could feel magical again. Because in the end, it's not about perfect animations or cutting-edge graphics. It's about making you feel the moment when your Pokémon lands the final blow, and the crowd in your head goes wild.